As much as those ideas weren't new, in a sense, he encapsulated our own subjective feeling.
He never seemed to waver in his willingness to connect with people and to communicate with people. Happy winter, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori.
And we are going to get into it this week.
All right, so our first segment is the Shitty Minutes. This is where one of us rants for usually longer than a minute about what's really grinding our gears this week. Austin, what do you got for us?
Do you think we should rename the Shitty Minute to like the shitty however the fuck long the person wants to talk?
I kind of dig the like false signifier of Shitty Minute.
Yeah.
It's like the anger inside of us just bubbles over so much that it has to be 7 minutes long or whatever.
That's right. Time doesn't matter. It's qualitative minute, not quantitative. All right. So this week I am going to chat about what I don't really know how to say it, but I'm just going to let words explode out of my mouth. I think I'm tired of the campaign from liberals or those on the left of attacking Wall Street from a moral perspective. That it's just greedy bankers, that they're bad people, that they're criminals, and it's a moral battle of good versus evil. Now, I am just about finished with Matt Taibbi's 2010 book called Griftopia, where he makes a very compelling argument that there are a lot of fucking criminal motherfuckers, and there are a lot of greedy motherfuckers that exist in the finance world. That's not my point. My point isn't to say that there is not greed and that there is no level of ethical indictment that should be leveled against such individuals. For some reason, I think the reason that it's affecting me negatively is that I feel like it's almost working as a counterweight against much of what the left is trying to do. And I think a lot of this circles around the cult of personality of Bernie Sanders. And I think that the use of it's Wall Street, it's Wall Street, it's Wall Street, 99% versus the 1% or the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, that rhetoric is useful. Especially, it was definitely useful during the primary campaign and to build momentum and during Occupy movements. But I feel like now there needs to be a shift to something that's a little bit more substantial in its analytical footing. And I think that just trying to create this good guys versus bad guys argument that I see so often is something that maybe we need to stop, because I think it's creating a reactionary distancing from the other side who is then going to be completely unwilling to listen to anything, because I think they just hear, oh, well, you guys are just angry with people who make money, or you guys are just bitching because you're resentful because you lost the election. And so I kind of want to make a pragmatic suggestion and say maybe we need to sort of change tack and go in a different direction from the left perspective that still recognizes the criminality that is embedded in the finance sector, that is supported and propped up by the government, and that is continually perpetuated by the elected officials who are betraying the interests of general Americans, but at the same time, just do something a little bit different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. I have one other question for you, though, about this.
Oh, okay.
How do you think a populist politician can rile up a base if not through a sort of moral, like almost simplified Manichaean view of the world, this good versus evil stuff? Like Trump clearly did, and even though he did it very poorly, it was still because it was populist and it had this moral essence to it, whereas Clinton's had basically nothing.
Well, he did it, but at what cost? And that's my problem. Is the cost was really bringing us into the gutter, and so now the platform, the playing field has been set, so to speak, to take place in the gutter. And so we're allowing this discussion to take place simply at this Manichaean good versus evil? What if we shift from good versus evil to a different simple bifurcation of right versus wrong, or just versus unjust? And I know people do, and I know that there is that, but that doesn't seem to be the primary thrust. And I'm just worried that when the left tries to become a party of morality, that they're playing on a playing field that, first of all, is actually an ultimate betrayal of the principles of leftism, which is to really eschew the idea that there is such a thing as morality, and let's try to aim for something different or better or higher, and something a little bit more open-ended that would maybe have a dispositional alignment towards higher ethical understandings than just the simple moral, frameworks that are imposed. Because I feel like we're playing ball with sort of conservative paradigm. So we're talking about good versus evil, but we're never going to win that. We're never going to fucking win that. And so I just don't know if it's pragmatically useful, ultimately.
Okay, I mean, you don't think FDR kind of did that and won a little bit on the good versus evil stuff?
Maybe, but, this isn't 1930. And I think that maybe we need to sort of to rethink some things. And again, I'm not saying that there hasn't been use, and that's why I'm trying to be pragmatic about this, not essentialist. I'm not saying that there was never a time where there was a genuine left versus right, good versus evil battle that could be waged. But I'm just wondering now if it just doesn't seem useful, man. When I talk with my friends, and I have a lot of friends that are conservatives, and when I read conservative publications, and I read a lot, probably more than I should for my own sanity, I just think that they're being further strengthened and fueled because they see this moral outrage from the left as just a bunch of crying, whining babies. And I think from the perspective of actually trying to affect those median voters, the ones in the middle, the intermediate voters, the ones that were the swing voters during the Trump campaign that voted for Obama in 12 and 08. I don't know. I'm just not sure that appealing to the goods and evils of Wall Street or the other side is what's actually going to convince them. I think that there has to be a more positive, substantive program.
Yeah, I wonder if this is more of a discussion on like the medium than it is the actual message itself. Like the whining and crybaby thing seems to be a lot more about tone and presentation, maybe more than actual content. But I think you mentioned a minute ago that what if we talked about just versus unjust instead of good versus evil? And that made me think about, we don't call people just or unjust. We call structures just or unjust. And people end up being good or evil, usually, or their actions, for instance. So maybe that's kind of the point, right? That we should stop talking about individual actors as being good and evil, since individuals just play roles within structures themselves, and talk about just versus unjust, actual structures and rules.
Yeah, I think ultimately that is the underlying thrust, is that let's stop being so concerned with individuals. I heard Nancy Fraser actually on Doug Henwood's most recent Behind the News, and I think she said something like this. She's like, I don't ever come out against Trump's supporters. It's not that they're this and they're that. And I think, and she rightly says that probably what ultimately sealed Trump's victory, or at least one of the things that sealed his victory, was when Hillary Clinton called Trump supporters deplorables.
Deplorables, yeah.
Because they were able to wield that, and they were to weaponize that and turn that into the elites think you're fucking stupid. And this is something that Martin Konings actually writes about in his book, Emotional Logic of Capitalism, that the progressive ideology has been wrong since the beginning, from the sort of era of, he's talking about Polanyi politics, but was it Walter Lippmann? The sort of Lippmann criticism was that, people are irrational and crazy, and we need government to actually teach them, to enlighten them with a progressive program. And that type of rhetoric is really ultimately, I think, counterproductive when we're trying to create better social relations. Because really that's what this is about. It's about creating better social relations, at least from my perspective. And I just want to make sure that we're not shooting ourselves in the foot.
No, I'm with you there. It's a pretty good segue, too, because we are doing our main segment today on the political and philosophical legacy of Mark Fisher.
Yeah.
You want to talk to the people real quick about who Mark Fisher is and why we're talking about this right now?
Yeah. So I never knew Mark. I knew about Mark. I did my MA in England at the University of Nottingham in 2010 is when I finished, I guess. Is that right? Because you finished your MA in 2009, right?
Yeah, so you're 2010.
Yeah, so I was 2010. And when I was there, he was one of those guys that was always talked about. And I think it was because of the legacy of his blog, which he blogged under the name of K-Punk, and that was actually the name of the blog, K-Punk. And then, of course, he wrote the book in 2009, Capitalist Realism. And the book was extremely influential in the British political philosophical sphere. I don't know if it really reached the other side of the pond as forcefully, but definitely in Ireland and the UK, the book had great impact, and it stimulated tons of debate because that was the time when like speculative realism was coming out, and it was the height of academic blogging, right? Like what, 2006 to 2011, 2012?
Yeah, thereabouts.
Thereabouts. And it was almost like he was one of those linchpin figures that if you were discussing leftist or anti-capitalist political theories, someone would mention capitalist realism, either favorably or disfavorably. But nevertheless, what was so amazing was that it had such an impact on stimulating discussion. And so I actually didn't even read him until I was doing my master's degree. So I didn't read capitalist realism until about, I guess it must have been the end of 2009 or the beginning of 2010. And that's because Troy and I actually were active in the blogosphere ourselves for a little while. We started in what, like 2007, 2008?
It had to be. I think it was earlier than that because we were still at college at the time. Yeah, it was definitely that blogosphere, I think, in a sense, kind of politicized us a bit, right? I mean, it flattened the world a bit in that philosophical and political theorists in the UK could write in English and we could read it as if it was coming from somebody who was next door. So we were becoming versed in UK and global politics at the same time as, we had this is before the financial crash, but the waning years of the Bush years and the Iraq war and everything, the things that probably politicized Americans the most, I think for us, probably because of the academic background of a lot of the blogosphere in the UK, that interested us probably a lot more than the more technocratic stuff in American politics. And so Mark Fisher was a huge part of that.
I think if you were to talk about that period blogosphere, if there was a Mount Rushmore, he'd be up there.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And for those who are listening who may not be aware, Mark Fisher passed away this week. And he's young. He's like 49, I think.
He's 48, yeah.
So yeah, it was fairly surprising, I think, for everybody, other than maybe those who knew him really well. So that's why we're decided to talk about him, since he had a pretty profound impact on both of us. I mean, I was thinking back on it the last couple days, and we both did our graduate degrees in the UK, even though we grew up in Southern California. That probably wouldn't have happened without the blogosphere, I would imagine, because we only became aware of sort of the work in continental philosophy and in philosophy of religion, and these areas that really, I think, first interested us when we were in college through the blogosphere. I mean, we were going to an evangelical undergraduate school where none of that stuff was being talked about. So we only found it in a sense like you would find, you'd find a condom lying in an alleyway behind someone and be like, oh, I wonder what this does, when you're 13 years old. And so you try to find out what it's all about. I think it was so interesting and different than what we had heard before and been taught that we were drawn to it. Possibly like moths to a flame, but...
No, yeah, in some ways. I remember we had this area in our library that I think they called the Ark. Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. I remember the Ark.
It was basically...
I did lots of reading up there.
Yeah, it was basically stacks of... How do you describe it? They're desks, but they were structured almost like bunk beds where they're stacked on top of each other, right?
Yeah.
And they called it the Ark because obviously it's an evangelical school, and they were cramming us in there in little stalls like the animals on the ark. But I remember being hidden up in there and reading blogs and commenting with these people around the world on, theological and philosophical concepts, and then writing blogs ourselves and feeling so radical, feeling like I was a part of something so transformative and important, and so almost like I had to hide. I didn't hide, but I felt that I should have felt like I should hide, but then I didn't want to, and that's where that radical feeling came from. It felt like, because I was immersed in this conservative community and these ideas were so counter to the ideas of our school's code and the broader culture, it seemed that there was this energy that was kind of coming through the computer screen. And like you said, it was amazing to connect with all of these various people around the world, and it was such an exciting time. So I think you and I talked about this before we started recording, but if people who weren't into the blogging scene at that time, or maybe they are a little young, or maybe they're a little old, and they weren't into the blogosphere, the academic blogosphere at that point, it might not make much sense, but I can't reiterate how much energy there was and how much output, like serious academic output, that took place on this forum. And I think the impact of that forum is something that has produced scholars and work, the quality of which I don't even know we can quantify. And I think Mark was one of those figures whose work and whose influence was so great in its output and effect that I think that people who just read his books or just hear about him now, I think you don't really even understand what's beneath the iceberg, so to speak, of impact that he had as a member of that community at the time.
Yeah, I mean, would it be correct to say that it kind of felt like an insurgency? Like, you're talking about the energy of it. It really did feel like, hey, the academic world has no place for this kind of work. It doesn't reward this kind of work, but this work is the most important thing. So we're going to do it for free on the blogosphere. It was kind of like a building out of insurgency. Against some oppressive force. Now, that's obviously romanticizing it heavily. And I think we'd admit now, looking back on it, it was overly romanticized.
Oh,
Same point.
It was a lot. In one sense, it was just a bunch of grad students and young professors sitting around, masturbating.
Yeah, being mad that they weren't taken as seriously as those who had tenure. Yeah. But at the same time, that fueled a lot of really good work. I mean, Mark Fisher's own book, Capitalist Realism, which we've referenced, I think was one of the first books that was published from Zero Books, which was a kind of left academic publisher that took a number of the leading figures of this academic blogosphere in the UK and the US and published their works. And so they became, kind of ubiquitous, and they could be consumed by people who weren't even immersed in the blogosphere at the time. So obviously there was a market for this kind of stuff, given that Zero Books and others came to exist out of it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the figures that are writing on Verso now, same sort of thing. I think if they didn't contribute a ton in their own personal blogs, there was a lot of discussion in the comment threads that was extremely important in developing a lot of our young minds. And I think, those of us who are in our early 30s, late 20s to mid 30s now, we'll say, especially, well, maybe even to the late 30s, we'll say, who are just starting to take up academic posts and publish books and things like that. It's figures like that I think are really going to be, when they're in their 50s and 60s, 70s, are going to have produced some amazing output, both as activists and as theorists as well, and as artists and as filmmakers. And, a lot of it was really bolstered by this community experience. And yeah. I mean, you're 100% right. I am fucking in Dublin today in so many ways because of this community, and I've been able to explore the world in so many ways because of this community. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that that Mark's impact contributed to that greatly.
I think you're kind of optimistic, Austin. I don't think we're going to have a lot of great works from the blogosphere community by the time that we're all 70, because we'll all be dead. or at best, teaching 10 classes at a time through precarious work and not having tenure. And
no way, man.
Be unable to publish.
The EU apparently just put forth a proposal to offer universal basic income for all citizens. It's going to happen, brother. We're going to be able to live above the means of subsistence. Maybe not like 100 times above the means of subsistence, but we're going to be able to live comfortably above the means of subsistence, and we're going to be able to write and do our academic shit and artistic work, and at the same time, we're still going to be developing badass technologies because the robots are going to be making the new generation of iPhone.
Hashtag full communism by 2030.
That's not optimistic.
Yeah, I think actually on that, joking aside, Fisher's book Capitalist Realism, probably, although the ideas in that book, which is basically just about the idea that there doesn't seem to be an alternative to capitalism that's allowed to be talked about or spoken about in general discourse, general political discourse, and
right.
that there's a sort of a sense in which the conditions that arise within capitalism are necessary for humanity, and that any attempt to speak about the contingency of capitalism or its historicity or the fact that it was constructed to be a certain way are obfuscated and obscured so that it seems like this is the only way human beings can be. As much as those ideas weren't new when Fisher wrote about them, in a sense, he encapsulated our own kind of subjective feeling in that time. I think it was published in 2008, 2009.
I think it was 2009, yeah.
This is a pretty tumultuous time for the English-speaking world, as well as the entire Western world, right? With the financial crash and everything. The credit crunch, they called it in the UK, right? And so he kind of took all those ideas and really, in a sense, I think, helped a lot of, especially younger academic thinkers, postgraduate students, maybe even young professors, take a lot of these ideas and situate them outside of the philosophical kind of theoretical context and right into what does this mean for us today in a way that you could look around you and see all of it happening. That was how I felt when I read the book originally, was this is exactly what everyone's been saying over the last couple of years during the crash and the completely failed attempt to reformulate society and economics after this crash. Basically just putting Band-Aids on the form of neoliberal capitalism that already existed. That was pretty prescient for that time. And I wonder if the book will have as much of a lasting impact, given that it was so prescient in that couple of years' time when it was published. Maybe it means more to West than it will mean to anybody else, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah,
maybe. Although he was really active with still talking right up until in the past few months here. I mean, even recently, as in the last couple of months, he was doing talks and writing, and his new book is, I think, either just come out or it's set to come out. And it was still very much talking about this idea of capitalist realism, even post-2008, where I was just at a meeting the other day for People Before Profit, and we were talking a little bit about Marx, his legacy, I guess, in the idea of capitalist realism. And there was a bit of optimism that maybe the capitalist realism has been overcome and that it is possible to think otherwise. And I want to believe that. And I do think that there are, what we might call interstices, right? Those openings, those spaces, those gaps in which there isn't absolute homogeneous control of the capitalist logic within the Western market societies or even in the global society. But I wonder to what extent those sites have any sort of purchase. And I don't know. So I almost feel like in some ways his book is more relevant, and you sort of mentioned this. It's almost more relevant now than ever before. I mean, Adam Curtis's documentary that I have talked about 1,000 times whenever I talk on any sort of platform, whether it's this podcast, other podcasts, whether it's with people in the lunchroom, I'm just fucking talking about this documentary because I loved it so much. But that's one of the things that Adam Curtis talks about in Hypernormalization. It's this idea that there is no alternative, which is the subtitle of capitalist realism. Is there no alternative, right? Or it's a question. But that's the idea of hypernormalization. It's the idea that we realize there's something wrong. Everyone's fucking anxious. Pharmaceutical prescriptions are through the roof, and diagnoses of mental fragile states or non-neurotypical mental issues are on the rise perpetually. But what the fuck is the alternative? You know, we're addicted to our own neuroses. And I don't know. It's this is what obviously Adam Curtis talks about, and I think it's something that Mark Fisher, he really articulated in a way that was, one, accessible, two, insightful, but three, that also I think gave us tools for feeling that anger and feeling that pressure, not just simply so that we would say, okay, well, what the fuck are we going to do? Oh, I'm just going to buy a self-help book and learn how to be a better subservient employee, but really to look at it and say, okay, how can we find those sites of opposition or antagonism? You know, and I think that's what he did. He problematized the issue of capitalist realism rather than just simply saying that's the way it is, fuck it. And I think it's building and building and building, and I feel like maybe 2016 is feeling that crisis even more than when it was published in 2009.
Yeah, I think it's especially that area of subjectivization that he focused so heavily on that was sort of unique to the way he presented it, rather than this kind of technocratic ideas, which everyone was kind of versed in, right? We'd all read about, you know, the Keynesianism and post-Keynesianism, and even stuff like modern monetary theory or MMT, whatever it is, right? Really technocratic ideas about economics and all that, whereas Fisher focused really on subjectivity, right? What is this doing to individuals and their own thinking about themselves, the way they relate to their beliefs, all these kinds of things. And that was why he focused really heavily on mental health as a political issue, rather than as a strictly health issue. Not that it's not a health issue, it certainly is, but that it's both a health issue and a political issue, or that health issues are always already political issues, would be a better way to couch it, right?
Right.
He talked about this idea of magical voluntarism as being at the root of a lot of the mental health issues, especially of younger people. But I think you could also say, given the last couple of years in the U.S., a lot of middle-aged people, especially in the white working class, where, you know, incidences of depression and other, would you call it, non-neurotypical states are on the rise, and suicides are up, and alcoholism and heroin addiction are up in some of these areas, which, as we've talked about before in the podcast, map on almost perfectly to areas where Trump dominated in the votes. These areas where middle-aged white people's life expectancy is you know, lessening. So this idea of magical voluntarism is the notion that every individual has the power to do whatever they want, right? The be all you can be. As long as you put enough work into it and have dedication, you will achieve everything you want, because America is a place of pure meritocracy, right? Which has sort of two modes. One is it tells you that there are no structural impediments to doing what you want to do. Every opportunity is open to you, no matter who you are. And the real negative side of that is when you fail, when you don't get that, the only person to blame is yourself, since you had the power to do it. It must just mean you didn't work hard enough, or you're worthless, or you're lazy. And so the problem lies within. And that leads to a depressive state, right? Depression usually is centered on an idea of feeling worthless and valueless, as if the world's better off without you, right? And so this magical voluntarism idea, he argued, was very parasitic during times of structural decay, when more and more people are unable to do what they want, or to fill a space in society even. Then these feelings of worthlessness and being fraudulent and all these kinds of things are going to be on the rise. And so it's no surprise that during these times, especially for young people who can't really find a way to make enough money to have a home or provide for a family or whatever it is, are going to end up depressed. And of course, that's exactly what we've seen. That really hit a chord for me, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this the other day. I was chatting, I don't remember with whom I was chatting. I was chatting with a friend of mine who works with trade unions over in Scotland. And we were chatting about a strike, I think, that had happened with like bus drivers or something like that. And we were talking about how even a bus driver somebody who works full-time, who takes care of a family, that he or she can oftentimes feel invalidated in the broader system because he or she is just a bus driver, or you just work at the corner shop, or you just work in a call center. And what it does is it basically just creates this really strict limit on what it means to be a valuable human being. And when you have a social system that is set up to value only certain types of persons based on how efficient they can produce for the market, you are creating a system that is simply driven by the creation of neuroses. And that's what it does. That's what capitalism does. Because the only people who are quote unquote successful are those who are making a certain amount of money or wielding a certain amount of power. And usually those two go together, right? Definitely if you don't have money but you have power, you will soon figure out how to wield that power into money. And if you have a lot of money, then you will just de facto have power. But it creates this sense, and those individuals are very few. And then the problem is that even when you are successful, there's always more. There's always somebody else who's successful. So it creates this system of competition, which the capitalist system boasts in. But really all that does is create a competitive environment that, again, just spreads these neuroses and these fears and anxieties as we are always comparing ourselves to somebody else and then devaluing what it is that we're doing because our social contributions aren't productive enough, because it's all about producing for the market. It's not about social contribution. It's not about value creation in a different sense. It's just simply about profit creation. And that's what's valuable. I don't know, man. I just think that that's gross. And that you're right. That is something that he really concentrated on. And it is important to understand.
Yeah, the really important part of that, I think, above all, is that when you connect the political theory to the psychology, that's not a thing that psychology typically does. Right? Like he talks about how cognitive behavioral therapy, which is some of the most successful kinds of psychotherapy, right? Tends to just help you reformulate your stories, your narrative about yourself, so that you can not be as neurotic and not be as destructively, I guess, neurotic.
Right. Well, it's about adapting to the system.
Exactly. Assuming the system itself can never be changed or should not be changed at the very least.
Because it's normal and you are abnormal.
Exactly, right? Which goes back to the capitalist realism. It's a form of trying to present itself as realism. This is the only way it can be. It's talking about the facts of the world. And that's cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the most successful. That's not need to talk about, basically just pharmaceuticalizing, that's my new word for it, people into adapting, right? Just give them drugs so that they can stop being sad, so they can go back to work and do the same things that are psychologically destructive, right? It's like if someone's running into a wall continuously, well, let's just, put pads on them. They'll still hurt themselves, but it will be less destructive and they can last longer at this. That's a horrible idea. You should just help them move away or get rid of the wall, perhaps, if it's in the way where people are trying to move. Capitalist realism is to assume that the wall cannot be moved and should not be moved.
Yeah, when I was really interested in studying disability for quite a while, when I was in grad school because of the woman that I was dating at the time, we talked a lot about this because she worked with autistic and dyslexic and dyspraxic, generally young children, but although also sometimes older, up to 18 and whatnot. But I remember we had lots of discussions about, I guess, they like to say that it's non-neurotypical rather than abnormal or something, or differently abled, is something that's often used in disability studies. But it's this idea of trying to figure out how to understand the non-standard forms of social life or human life that are existent that don't quite fit, and to figure out how do we create a society that is more inclusive. And the old way of doing it was just like you said, it's just simply, well, you're wrong. I'm the analyst and you are the one who has the issue, or I'm the behavioral therapist and you're the autistic, or I'm the teacher and you're the dyslexic and you need to be fixed because you are not normal. But there's been a big push in recent years to try to say, that's imposing a very strange and damaging top-down authoritarian view of what it means to live within a given society, and that there needs to be something that's more open to that. And so there was something called the social model of disability that was developed, I think, in the 70s, 60s, 70s. And the social model of disability basically tries to say that, no, the only reason that disabilities exist is because we have a society that deems what is able-bodied people and what are disabled people. And so we need to, build a wheelchair ramp. And when you have a wheelchair ramp, well, then the person in the wheelchair isn't disabled because they are able to get into the building, right? And so that's what the idea is. And then, of course, there are some people that say that that's not radical enough, and we need to kind of ubiquitize the idea of disability altogether, because everyone is actually ultimately disabled. It just depends on how we determine what they're able to do, right? So, like, I can't jump on top of a roof, so I am disabled. So what do? I build a fucking ladder, and that helps me. So that's why we're all cyborgs, right? Is we use technology to overcome our limitations. But everybody has limitations. It's just that, one, we're limited, and two, we have developed society in such a way to only work towards certain majorities. But nevertheless, there's this interesting way that's trying to unpack within disability studies, within mental health, to unpack the relationship between individuals and communities and people groups and the social structures that determine or condition how that they're able to function. And I think that's why the idea of mental health is something that's so important, because it seems to be one of those issues that is affecting individuals and communities so greatly. As you said, what did you call it? The pharmaceuticalization?
Something like that.
The pharmaceuticalization of the Western world is really taking off, especially in America, where it's like, I can't remember, I think it's like 60%. Don't quote me on it, but you can do a quick Google search. It's like 60% of all pharmaceutical drugs manufactured in the world are consumed in the United States. There's something fucking wrong, man. There is something wrong, and we need to look at what it is. Why is it that is it just that Americans have a better understanding of how to grasp with their mental issues? Is that what it is? Well,
definitely not.
I don't think that's the answer, And so what is it? Why is there something that is driving us mad? And what is it that's driving us mad? And then how do we fucking fix it?
Yeah, man, I read the Capitalist Realism so long ago, but I remember this one paragraph which kind of shocked me in its simplicity, where Fisher just said, look, most of psychiatry and psychology tend to argue that when people are depressed, it's because they have chemical imbalances in the brain. And you'll hear that all the time in popular discourse, right? And that's 100% true. The problem is, why would we assume that chemical imbalance in the brain is not possibly caused by something else?
Right.
Why does that have to be an origin without a cause? Right? Could it be that social structures are causing imbalances in the brain? That your beliefs, perhaps, even about yourself, are causing chemical imbalances in your brain? And that kind of shocked me, because I had always thought about this idea of, the biological is the base level. Mm. Nothing causes that. It just is, whether you like it or not. But we know that that's not the case at all. Even just things like epigenetics study the effects of environment on gene expression and stuff. So, that's part of the whole subjectivization thing, right? We're just conditioned to believe that, whatever our brains are, that's just the way it is. We can't do anything about it. Mm. That reinforces the status quo. Mm. It says, therefore, just, pump people full of drugs and help them get through it, because we ain't changing the way the world is.
Yeah, as what is it, Zizek that says it? Or is it Frederick Jameson that says it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism?
Yeah, and that's kind of what capitalist realism was all about, right?
Right.
Why is it that we can't think about an alternative? Now, with that subjectivization thing, I think the last thing we could talk about was a more recent essay that Fisher wrote on what he called the vampire castle.
Such a great fucking term, man.
Yeah, it's a great term. One of the things that, in talking about this idea of subjectivity and our own beliefs about ourselves and what's possible and things like this, Fisher made great pains to point out that leftists typically give lip service to solidarity and to social structures and all the things that we always talk about on the podcast, right? Don't talk about individuals, talk about structures. While in practice, they do the opposite. All they ever talk about are individuals. What are individuals doing? Are they actually Are their mental states ones that are about equality and solidarity, or have they ever said a sexist or racist or thing that could be possibly interpreted as sexist or racist or anti-identitarian or whatever? Whereas capitalists do the opposite. They give lip service to individualism. It's all about picking yourself by your bootstraps, hard work, dedication, meritocracy. But in action, they always act in class solidarity. 2008 and 9 was the greatest example of that, right? Yeah, it's all about picking yourself up by your bootstraps, but the second the system's in trouble, everybody who has ownership, has power, rushes to save that power when it was in danger. Altogether, and nobody questions it, right? We only question things like the bailout and stuff afterwards, right? It was just an obvious thing that it had to happen at the moment to save everybody, which really meant saving the status quo of power relations. And that really struck me in the sense that, yeah, it is kind of that way, right? This individualism versus social structures things is really more of about how do we think about ourselves versus how do we act.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was reading the essay that you sent over to me this morning about vampire castles, which I just want to keep saying because I think it's such a great term. Or as he says throughout the essay, VC, the VC. I'm reading a book by Jacques Badet that's called Marx with Foucault, and it is basically trying to bring two thinkers that are generally consumed. I'm sorry, Foucault with Marx, not Marx with Foucault. Foucault with Marx, but he's trying to bring two thinkers that are generally understood as being quite disparate in their ideas, and he's bringing them into dialogue with one another, and not trying to just conflate them and say that really Foucault was just agreeing with Marx, but trying to create an interesting dialogue between them. And one of the things he talks about is the relationship of the minority and the majority to the totality. And as I was reading this, there's a section where he talks about one is a minority, not in relation to the majority, but in a relation to the totality. And for some reason, I had never really thought about this before, even though I have with my own research, because it actually fits really well into what Sartre, I think, was getting at with his idea of seriality and the critique of dialectical reason. But it's the idea that a minority group, let's take, women's struggles or gay rights or transgender rights or disability rights. The minority group is considered a minority not in relation to the majority per se, but it's in relation to the totality, which means that there's a relational similarity that the majority also has, because the majority is considered the majority not in relation to the minority, but in relation to the totality. Now, there is also a relational there's a relation between the minority and the majority that needs to be understood. But in one sense, something that for some reason I had never thought about, but that came up a lot as I was reading the essay on Vampire Castle, was this idea of identitarian ideas from what he called the post-structuralist left seems to really miss out on the real impetus of leftist class struggle and the efficacy of that by concentrating on the minority just trying to grasp at what the majority has in relation to the totality, rather than trying to change the totality itself. So rather than the minority standing up saying, no, we don't necessarily just want equal rights under these conditions, we want to change the conditions. And yes, you can still fight for equal rights. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be equal rights within the totality, but the bigger program that can't be missed is that even equal rights is still taking place inside the vampire castle, and you're still being fed on. And that's the issue, is it's not just about inclusion, it's about transformation of the entire situation, the serial situation, the vampire, get out of the fucking vampire castle, and build a new one. And that's the issue. And that's something that I think there's something interesting in that. There's something powerful in that. But I want to be careful, too, that I don't say, oh, well, then that means that we shouldn't fight for equal rights for women. No, of course not. Of course not. It's just that equal rights for women are assuming the paradigm of rights that are established by the totality, which goes back to what we were talking about last week, which are based on liberal notions of rights, rather than a real transformation and a new program of building afresh.
Yeah, these identities are constructed by the totality. And they're constructed in unequal ways that cause suffering to very specific individuals. so that African American people suffer a lot more because of that identity within a structure that constructs the identity of African Americanism the way it does. So that's a difficult way for me to say that.
Well, but it's because the structure constructs what it means to be human. It constructs
Exactly.
it constructs what it means to be a citizen, and what is a proper citizen? A white male with some money. Whereas if you're a black female, then you don't have the same level.
And this is not being colorblind. This is actually looking at why are the colors the way that they are. Why are minorities, in this more technical sense that you're talking about, constructed over against the totality of the way that they are. Seeing that genealogy, that construction, and then seeking to dismantle it and develop a new one. So you're really seeing all of it at once. And the idea is that if you only look at the identities themselves, you end up with a really sort of neurotic focus on them. And this vampire castle idea focuses on this subjectivity part of it, right? Where when all we see are identities, and we don't see the background that creates them or constructs them as they are, the totality, as you're saying, then we end up like, he quotes Nietzsche from Genealogy of Morals and says, this worse thing than Christianity is on the horizon. More guilt-inducing, more controlling, worse for humanity. And so there's a lot of... Fisher doesn't sort of hold his punches back in this essay, right? He basically calls these new leftists like the new slave priests of Nietzsche, in that they're feeding like vampires. They're sucking you in and feeding off of your guilt and misery, making you feel horrible about yourself because of whatever maybe racist or sexist or misogynistic thoughts even you may have. And then basically waiting for you to dismantle yourself and come pleading to them for forgiveness. Rather than saying, hey, how about instead of this current system, we believe and we fight for a better system for everybody, and sort of attracting people with something instead of making them feel horrible, degrading themselves and hoping that they'll come to you for forgiveness. And this was written like 4 years ago, I think.
In 2013. Yeah, 2013.
Yeah. And mostly about UK politics. He was talking about Russell Brand and Owen Jones and some issues in British politics at the time. But man, this essay felt so prescient right now. This is almost exactly how I think you would diagnose the U.S. left politics currently, especially
100%.
after the Clinton lost the election.
100%. 100%. And with the idea that in America right now, the left, at least maybe up until after the Trump election, where the left seems to be in a state of trying to figure out who they are now, but especially for the last few years, the left has been consumed with identitarianism, right? So much so that many people are actually saying that the reason that, the rise of the alt-right has come to prominence is because that's the right's response to identitarianism. You've got all of these people clinging to these essential identities, that it seems to then be like the other side is trying to cling to their identities because they don't feel that their quote unquote identity is being respected. Which is why, supposedly if in like certain American polls, like white males feel like they're the most oppressed people group. So what have they done? They've galvanized together to create their identity as, this sort of like American nationalistic idea of what it means to be human or to have your identity. Yeah, it's a really fucking amazing essay. I would say if you have not read it, definitely check it out. It's called Exiting the Vampire Castle. Were there any highlights from the essay that you wanted to mention?
Just that thing I mentioned earlier about the difference between capitalists and leftists as being lip service to individualism versus acting in class solidarity. I thought it was a great diagnosis, even of today in the U.S., right? In that when Trump wins the election, is the left's focus on how terrible the people are who voted for Trump? And that basically we should, in a sense of moral grandstanding, post to Facebook about how terrible we think the next 4 to 8 years are going to be, and that our protests are basically going to be, you're a horrible person and that people who voted for you are horrible people, and hopefully you'll be convinced of that at some point. So you come crawling back to left-center politics, which is, of course, basically a way of feeling good about yourself and guaranteeing you never, ever win anything in politics ever again. Or is it a struggle to develop a system that is better than the status quo, that is more equal and more just, and that everybody, including, dare I say, the white working class, that Now, I'm not saying that their grievances are 100% justified. Of course not. But understanding why they think the way that they do and trying to appeal to them, that's just politics. You don't have to accuse people of being good or evil or right or wrong or whatever in a moral sense. You just have to do politics, which is look at the structures that create the conditions or create the symptoms, I should say, that we see, and then try and change them to have better symptoms.
Yeah, I like that. Create better symptoms. You mentioned this, I think, last week, where you said something about how it's still control. It's just about different types of control, or something along those lines. I can't remember how you said it, but yeah, there will always be symptoms. You know, I mean, that's. I think if there is such a thing as the human experience, I think it's that human consciousness is going to create some kind of symptomatic response that we're going to be perpetually trying to reorder what images we create of our social worlds. And symptoms aren't necessarily a bad thing. It's just about trying to perpetually organize the conditions so that our symptomatic relations are more equitable or more egalitarian or less alienating.
Yeah, I think it was Corey Robin that has a great phrase where he says politics, or leftist politics or something, is about turning like unassailable misery into general unhappiness. Yeah. Like, I just want to be unhappy. I don't want to be miserable to the point where I don't see the point of going on, right? Because unhappiness is manageable.
Did you see the post by Anthony Paul Smith about politics is weather on his On und für sich blog?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, yeah. This is another one of those sort of towering figures from the blogosphere, is that blog in particular, which is still going strong, but it's obviously the activity is not quite the same. But something Anthony said was about politics as weather, and he said, "So I treat politics, like the weather. My anger hasn't gone away, but it's anger at the storm blowing out of paradise. And how do you fight a storm? You weather it. Learn to escape it, to find places of refuge, to shelter others from its violence with your own body. But the time to affect the climate for good, to change the weather, is long past." And that kind of resonated with me. It's a little bit more of a despairing take on things than I'm generally inclined towards, but there is still something beautiful about that seems to fit with that Corey Robin quote that you were talking about, how better to be, unhappy than miserable or whatever. And I think that's kind of one of the things that he's talking about. It's the idea that, look, you can't change the fucking weather, but we can still figure out how to be we can be unhappy and not miserable because of the frostbite that's oncoming.
Yeah, even those little bits of, sheltering other people with your body are meaningful. Yes, I think if we're going to say anything about Mark Fisher's legacy, it's that it's a very important one to us. And I think if we trace our own genealogy back, we find that he is a huge node in that web of our own intellectual histories. And that if you haven't ever read his stuff, go back. The K-Punk archives I was looking at last night are still up. There's a shitload there. You can read stuff on music journalism, all the way up to really abstract political theory. So I would definitely encourage that. Read Capitalist Realism. Read the couple of essays we're talking about. There's one he wrote called Good for Nothing, which is about this mental health and politics issue. I think it was kind of summarized from some of his stuff in Capitalist Realism. And then, of course, Exiting the Vampire Castle. Go back and read those and take something from it, because there's a lot there, especially for today.
Yeah. And now, real quick, I do want to say something, too. As I said at the beginning, I never met Mark. I've only ever known people who have known him, but we have a lot of mutual friends on Facebook. And over the past few days, I've seen some really lovely, heartfelt tributes to him and to his family on Facebook. And I think a lot of times it's really easy to forget the human in all of this. And I just want to say, I don't want to say who it was, but there's a scholar in London who her work is extremely powerful. And she wrote a very touching and personal thing to her Facebook friends because she was very close with Mark. And one of the things that she talked about was not just his work, but also the personal side of him. As someone who was very open about his own struggles with mental health and depression, there were other things that I think people don't get to see in the personal life. And she talked about how he loved to dance and how he was a really good dancer and how he was just open with his time. And I've read a couple of different tributes from people that were talking about this. And there seems to be a common trend here that even though he was feeling that despair of capitalist realism, he never seemed to waver in his willingness to connect with people and to communicate with people and to work with people and to make art and to help other artists and to help other theorists. And so, I don't know, I think there was really something lovely about that you can learn a little bit about the breadth of the man behind the work, even though he's no longer going to be producing more work with us, and at least in material terms. And so, I don't know, it's really been quite interesting. Like I said, I don't know the guy, but I feel like, especially in our circles, the academic world has been mourning for the last few days.
It's so funny, huh, that you can totally tell whenever a influential figure dies, the platitudes come out full bore, right? You can always tell when a really authentic one is there. It's just obvious. It's very clear. It's really hard to lie. Really hard to make it not clear or obvious that you're lying. Or, sort of hyperbolizing about someone's reputation in these areas. And it's overwhelmingly obvious, the ubiquity of the anecdotes and the stories and how similar they all are in terms of talking about his character and the way he inspired people and gave of his own time. And it's very clear that these were all very authentic.
Yeah. So, rest in peace, Mark. God, man, let's make a fucking better world for his legacy, and let's hope that his influence will help us to get out of the fucking vampire castle.
Yeah, man.
All right, so on a somber turn, let's move on to the next segment here, and let's chat about something that does give us hope in this world, the world that is being suppressed by the ubiquity of capitalist realism. Let's turn to Troy and see what is giving him meaning in the midst of hegemony.
So my sticky leaves this week, I had trouble figuring out what to do this week because, as you know, Austin, I'm currently reading David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest.
So we won't see you till next year.
Yeah, so I only read fiction at night before I go to bed.
Right.
So it's going to take me a long-ass time to finish this book. I'm only maybe 2/7 of the way through.
Yeah. And what is it? It's 1,000 pages, right?
Yeah, it's 1,000 pages.
And that's not including the end notes or footnotes.
I think it is including the footnotes. But
that is including footnotes. Okay.
It's part of the prose. You have to read all that stuff. It's a pretty incredible experience. It's unlike any book I've ever read. It's ridiculous and insane. And I have trouble following large portions of it, and then all of a sudden there's some incredible amount of profundity that hits you, and you just have to stop and go to bed and think about it. It's probably deeper than almost any, even philosophical text I think I've ever read. Wow. It's so incredibly full of depth, and you can only read a few pages at a time, I feel like, and then you have to let it ruminate because it's so heavy. And this book has been cast into the new sincerity movement, this idea of the irony and challenge of postmodernism, including that, but then also having getting rid of the cynicism and nihilism that's inherent in postmodernism and replacing it with a level of sincerity and care and empathy for human beings. And that's definitely a theme in this book. And I think perhaps if I do another Sticky Leaves in 4 months when I'm done, I can talk a little bit more about that and the insane reading experience as well. I mean, the long sentences that he does away eventually with any punctuation whatsoever and just builds into this incredible intensity and anxiety. You have to read it to really understand. But what I want to do today, just to kind of lighten the mood a little bit, is there's one section where one of the characters, James Incandenza, he's passed away in the books, but there's a filmography or a footnote, one single footnote that's basically his entire filmography. It's 30 pages long, this footnote.
Oh yeah, I've heard about that.
And it's a completely made up, constructed filmography of this experimental filmmaker. And it has the titles of these movies, these films, and just short descriptions. And some of them are the most hilarious things I think I've ever heard in my life. I was literally cracking up at like 1 o'clock in the morning reading this. This is a couple weeks ago, but I wanted to talk about it now. Here's just a couple of them I thought were my favorites. One film is called The Union of Theoretical Grammarians in Cambridge. It's a documentary and closed caption interviews with participants in the public Steven Pinker, Avril M. Incandenza debates on the political implications of prescriptive grammar during the infamous Militant Grammarians of Massachusetts Convention, credited with helping incite the MIT language riots of 1997. And this book was written before that, so obviously this is all made up. The idea that Steven Pinker got thrown into this idea of prescriptive grammar and that it led to riots is hilarious to me. Another one is Fun with Teeth, which is a Kosinski-Updike Peckinpah parody where a dentist performs 16 anesthetized root canal procedures on an academic he suspects of involvement with his wife. Another one is Imminent Domain, which is about 3 memory neurons and the inferior frontal gyrus of a man's brain fight heroically to prevent their displacement by new memory neurons as the man undergoes intensive psychoanalysis.
That's actually fucking brilliant, dude.
I know, right? This next one's called Various Small Flames, which is a parody of neo-conceptual structuralist films of some dudes that I'm not going to try to name, full of end-frame images of myriad varieties of small household flames, from lighters and birthday candles to stovetop gas rings and grass clippings ignited by sunlight through a magnifying glass, alternated with anti-narrative sequences of a man sitting in a dark bedroom drinking bourbon while his wife and an Amway representative have acrobatic coitus in the background's lit hallway.
What the fuck is
I know, right? What the fuck?
And he denied being a heroin addict.
Another one. Cage High. The figure of death presides over the front entrance of a carnival sideshow whose spectators watch performers undergo unspeakable degradations so grotesquely compelling that the spectators' eyes become larger and larger until the spectators themselves are transformed into gigantic eyeballs and chairs, while on the other side of the sideshow tent, the figure of life uses a megaphone to invite fairgoers to an exhibition in which, if the fairgoers consent to undergo unspeakable degradations, they can witness ordinary persons gradually turning into gigantic eyeballs.
How many films are there?
There's like 100? I don't know. It's like a lot of them.
And is this footnote just listing the filmography, or is it like interspersed throughout?
No, it's the entire footnote is just all the films listed. I got to give you a couple more because they're
30
so great.
pages?
Yeah. Homo Duplex. Interviews with 14 Americans who are named John Wayne but are not the legendary 20th century film actor John Wayne.
And it's called Homo Duplex?
Yeah. The man who began to suspect he was made of glass. A man undergoing intensive psychotherapy discovers that he is brittle, hollow, and transparent to others, and becomes either transcendently enlightened or schizophrenic.
There's actually some genius in some of these ideas.
I know, right? It's so amazing. One more. Good-looking men in small, clever rooms that utilize every centimeter of available space with mind-boggling efficiency. That's the title.
Say it one more time.
Good-looking men in small, clever rooms that utilize every centimeter of available space with mind-boggling efficiency.
Uh-huh. Okay. And what does it have a synopsis for that?
Otherwise known as Wolf of Wall Street, Scorsese's film, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it just keeps going. I could do a bunch more, but it would take forever to go through all of them.
So you're enjoying the experience so far?
Oh, I'm loving it. It's incredible. It's such an amazing work. I can't believe I hadn't gotten to it until now, but I feel like you have to be at a certain place to really enjoy this work. You have to be able to love the irony and the ridiculousness of some of it and see the profundity underneath all of it.
Okay, if you could, I know you haven't read the whole book, but what is the 2 to 3 sentence synopsis? What the fuck is the book about?
I don't even know. I mean, it's about there's a couple different like locations. So there's like Enfield Tennis Academy, which is David Foster Wallace himself was kind of a tennis prodigy, I guess, in high school, and he kind of fell off and couldn't actually become pro in college. And so one of the settings is this tennis academy for basically high school kids who want to go into like a boarding school and focus on becoming tennis pros. And so the sort of main character, Howland Condenza, is at this tennis academy. He's kind of a genius, but no one can really tell he is because he's sort of neurotic and weird and unable to communicate himself to others.
Is this David? Is that David Foster Wallace? Is that him?
Oh, you certainly see there's a level of that, right? And there's lots of talk about how this character is sort of Hamlet. And so there's lots of literary allusions to Hamlet and his own family. And there's also a psych ward where a number of the characters are, which at this point in the book is not connected to the tennis academy other than thematically. And there's like a medical attaché there's like all this political stuff. There's political insurrectionaries. It's set up in a world where in the 90s, Canada and the US joined alliances and became one country. And I think Mexico too. I can't remember exactly. But all this political intrigue, and there's a bunch of Quebec-y separatists who want to become their own country again, and they're like fighting against this supra government. Like it's totally insane.
Did you see the end of the tour?
No, I'm waiting to see it until after I finish the book.
Okay, so I have not read Infinite Jest, obviously, and I have seen the film. I just watched it the other day, and I've watched a lot of interviews with him, so I feel like I sort of get him to an extent. Plus, I've got a friend, Scott, who is obsessed with David Foster Wallace. He's read Infinite Jest cover to cover, and I think he's either in the middle of or just finished listening to the audiobook version as well. So, like, when he goes for walks and shit like that, he listens to Infinite Jest.
That's real, man.
Yeah. So, and then now he's reading, what was the last book that he wrote? Was it The Pale King?
The Pale King, yeah.
Yeah, The Pale King. He's reading that right now. But, so I have, I think I've heard a lot about David Foster Wallace, and I feel like this year I'm going to undertake something. I don't know if I'm going to start Infinite Jest or what, because my reading list...
Start with the nonfiction.
Start with the nonfiction?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
But I watched the end of the tour, and it was a really interesting journey alongside this figure that you can tell really just wants to connect and communicate with other individuals. And there's a really good... The relationship that he has with Dave Lipsky, as portrayed at least by Lipsky, because this film is an adaptation of Lipsky's book. It's a really interesting relationship, and I think it gives really interesting insight into at least how Lipsky viewed, David Foster Wallace's struggles with his own success or desire for success and his public persona and his own battles with depression and things of that nature. And this actually fits kind of back into what we were talking about with Mark Fisher. And, the idea of This Is Water, which is the commencement speech that David Foster Wallace, that he kind of gives, kind of fits on well to the idea of capitalist realism. Very much so. That, and I think it's a really interesting biographical journey that the film takes you on. So I like the film a lot. It's very subtle and it's very slight. It's not big and huge with big dramatic turns or anything like that, but it's a nice narrative. It's a nice story, but that it also has some teeth to it,
Yeah, I think Infinite Jest is just all teeth. Like you feel like the book's kind of attacking you, I feel like, in a lot of ways. But in a way that is meant for your betterment, so I'm okay with it. Yeah.
God, man, maybe I should just jump in. What do you think? Should I just jump in, man?
Dude, I would love to read this alongside of you. That'd be amazing.
Fuck. Okay,
I got a book club. Oh, I was a Don book club. Infinite Jest.
How many pages are you in?
Like 200.
You're 200 pages in.
200.
All right. I have like 2 other fiction books that I have to read ahead of this. But I feel like by the time I get there, or they're not fiction books, but they're light reading, we'll say. By the time I finish them, I have a feeling you're only going to be 400 pages in. So I'll jump in then.
That'll be good too, because then I can recall things that happen in the beginning of the book as you talk about them, since I'll have forgotten.
Deal. It'll be like a staggered book club. And then when you're at 800 and I'm at 400, then we get somebody else to start, and then we get to just have this infinite loop. And then when you're done with the book, you start over again, and it'll be like, you know, when you do row, row, row your boat, but you do it as, what's it called? Where you do it as
roundabout?
A round, yeah, it's called, what's it called? Yeah, it's called a round. It's just called a round. Yeah, that's what we'll do.
Or a pyramid scheme of reading fiction.
Yeah, either way, whatever. So are you recommending people buy this book, or are you recommending that they wait until they're in the right stage of life?
Hell no. Don't buy this book. What are you talking about?
Don't buy this.
No, of course I would encourage people to read this book. Just be aware that it's not the kind of thing you sit down and read for, like, you know, momentary pleasure. It's kind of hard work, but it's very rewarding, especially when you start reading a 30-page filmography that is making you crack up like 30 times.
Yeah. Right on.
All right, so our next segment is the bullshitting segment, where we just talk about something totally meaningless or ridiculous, or maybe we don't know anything about it. In this case, we were struggling a bit to come up with a topic that would fit, since the rest of the episode's been kind of heavy. We thought we'd just talk a little bit about the Dubs, the Warriors, making paste out of the Cavaliers last night. This is basketball for all those who are out there.
That's right. So in hockey last night, the Warriors destroyed the Cavaliers. No, I didn't watch the game. So they won by how many?
1 billion.
And Steph Curry scored 500 million?
Yeah, I turned the game off in like the beginning of the fourth quarter because it was too much.
Really?
It was like he's already dead. Stop.
So do you think that the Warriors, because obviously they've lost a handful of games this year, so do you think that they're just basically able to switch it on whenever they want? And last night they were like, hey, we just need to make sure that LeBron knows that what happened last year is not going to happen this year.
Well, it was emotional. Like they wanted to make paste out of them. They wanted to flatten the Cavs because, you know, they played on Christmas Day, and it was the Warriors were winning the entire game. And then at the end, they kind of let the foot off the gas. The Cavs came back, and then there was a ridiculous non-call where Durant got fouled at the last second, and there was no call, and the Warriors lost. NBA came out the next day and said that there was a missed call, and they made a mistake. So you can tell that the Warriors were just like so upset about it, and they take it personally.
That's like if your chick bangs another dude, and then the next day is like, hey, I realized that I fucked up. It's like, God damn it! It's like, I know you were drunk, and you were like, but that doesn't do anything for last night, yo. God damn it.
Yeah, it's like when the person brings it up, like, often. Like, rather than just apologizing and be like, look, that was a total douche move. I'm so sorry. Like, the next they're like, yeah, and then remember the time I slept with your best friend? I mean, wow. How terrible was that, right? You're just like, God, stop bringing it up already.
Yeah, I've already forgiven you and we've moved on.
And so, yeah, they came out and just destroyed the Cavs. And, like, even, like, go on YouTube and look at Durant blocking LeBron. LeBron never gets blocked. Like, he's so athletic and has such amazing hands and body control. He never gets blocked. And Durant just, like, highlight blocked him.
Yeah, and it wasn't like a block where, you know, like, the ball came out of his hand and he knocked it into the crowd. It was like, it was still in LeBron's hands and he blocked it into his face.
We call that a stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, and then LeBron fell to the ground. Yeah, it was pretty legit, man.
And then a little later, Draymond Green ran into LeBron in transition and got called for a flagrant foul, even though clearly he was trying to steal the ball.
Right.
Since it was just such a tense moment and it's LeBron and everything. And so Draymond later in the game, when he was walking towards the bench, did a LeBron flail your arms move to like make fun of him and mimic what he does when he flops on that same play. So they take it very personally, the Warriors, which makes me wonder what it's going to be like when they inevitably meet in the finals again in June. Because it'd be the first time in NBA history, two teams have met 3 years in a row. It's never happened. Lakers Celtics didn't do it in the 60s or the 80s. It's never happened. And each team's won once, and each time under pretty dramatic circumstances. So Yeah, it's going to be a bloodfest, man. These two teams really, really don't like each other. And you can tell the Warriors take it way more personally than LeBron does.
Really?
He's just coasting. Yeah, he didn't care at all.
Really? Do you think that he's kind of just coasting, though, because he's able to turn it on in the playoffs and he wants to save a little bit?
Part of it, yeah, because he can. But also, that's kind of been to his detriment as well in the past. When the Spurs lost to the Heat back when the Big Three were together, in a really, really close series, right? Ray Allen hits a three that kind of wins the series. And the Spurs came back the next year incredibly angry and just wanting to destroy the Cavs. And they did. They just wiped the floor with the Heat. Not the Cavs, excuse me, the Heat. In the next year in 2014.
Yeah, did they sweep them or they won in 5 or something?
Yeah, it was in 5, I think. But I mean, it was not even close. Like, they beat him by 30-plus points multiple times.
Yeah.
And LeBron played horrible. And a lot of people were accusing him of just coasting and not being able to he needed to get more angry and be a little bit more emotional and be a team leader. And of course, last year he has the most incredible performance in the history of professional basketball. So I wonder, I'm really intrigued by seeing that happen again this year. I really hope nothing happens as far as injuries, because I want to see these two really angry teams who dislike each other so heavily.
I've never seen your crazy eyes get so lit up about like aggression in sports before. Like usually that's my thing. I'm like, yeah, mixed martial arts. These guys are gonna fuck each other up, and you like literally, you're like, I want to see this anger expressed on the court. Of course, I like how you're like, I want to see this anger and aggression appropriately funneled through skillful basketball on the court. But
of course. It happens through like blocking someone's shot right back into their face, using their own power against them, which is so finesse, right?
Yeah,
and dunking in people and blocking shots from behind. Like that's so much better than like jumping on a guy or wrestling him to the ground or whatever.
It's the same thing. Ontologically, it is the same thing. What's the difference between a skyscraper and an anthill ontologically? Nothing. It's just
man.
Difference of complexity. That's all it is. It's the same ontological plane.
See, this is what Deleuze does to you. It ruins the awesomeness of difference.
No, man. It just makes it, more interesting.
When everything is difference, nothing is difference.
Yeah, exactly. Everything is different. Nothing is different. It's all on the same ontological plane. I can watch ants climb up an anthill and think about workers building skyscrapers and, those pictures that you see where they're hanging out on those steel beams, and I can connect that to the struggle of ants building their anthill. It's beautiful. It's an ecological mindset.
I always had so much anxiety seeing those pictures of dudes eating lunch on top of a skyscraper.
Dude, have you seen the one of the guy now who just free climbs up on buildings like that? And there's like YouTube videos of him with a fucking GoPro on his head, and he's like hanging from these skyscrapers. Literally, there's nothing below him. He's fucking hanging. His hands, he's got no ropes, no chains, no supports, anything. And he's hanging. His hands are just up there. And then he looks down, and you see him. You're with him as he climbs up to the top. And then you see him hanging and looking up at his hands. And then he looks down, and there's just fucking like 1,000 feet or something ridiculous like that. Oh my God, bro. I'm freaking out right now just thinking about it. Oh, the YouTube video. You're sitting there, you're like, no, what are you doing? And then he jumps at certain points, and you're like, God, man, people are crazy.
This segment's not going to have as much substance to those who can't see the facial takes that you're showing when you're making all these noises.
My whole body, I'm like convulsing.
The gesticulations, you need those.
I'm acting out what's happening. Jesus, man. Well, yeah, I know. I'm looking forward to that. It'll be good. I too, I hope there are no injuries because, I think that the Golden State Warriors they might be in terms of skill right now, they've got to be, this might be the best team that's ever existed. Yeah,
and they're kind of coasting. Like last night was them awake,
right?
And they just destroyed one of the best teams, the defending champions.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's going to be interesting when it gets to playoff time, whether or not they can do that consistently, or if their anger sort of folds in on itself and makes them sort of forget to play like a team. I don't know. We'll see.
So they won the championship 2 years ago. They lost last year. If they win it this year and say they win another one next year or get to another one next year, say they get to 4 or 5 finals in the next 6 years and they win 3, they're in the conversation for being the greatest team of all time, right?
That's a long ways away, man. A lot can happen.
Yeah.
I mean, one twisted ankle from Curry, and we're talking a different story.
Hey,
so.
Don't put that mojo. Knock on wood, everybody. Don't put that fucking shit out there. Not mojo. What's the word? Like juju?
Juju, yeah.
Yeah, don't put that shit out there.
Let's let him accomplish something before we start talking about that stuff, though.
All right. Sounds good. All right. Well, shifting to a completely different mode now. Let's start talking about music. Michael, what is going on this week in hip-hop?
What's up?
With first-class legroom, free cocktails for everyone, and a schedule you can depend on.
Hey, what's up, podcast internets? This is Michael Burns with This Week in Hip Hop on the Owls at Dawn podcast. Thanks, as always, to Troy and Austin for letting me hang out. This is another slow week in terms of new music. I think the first few weeks of the year are always kind of slow in terms of new releases and stuff coming out. So I'm going to talk about something that's not so current. Luckily, there's a bunch of stuff coming out in the next few weeks, so you can expect in the coming weeks to hear me talking about new projects from Kel Chris, Action Bronson, Your Old Droog. A lot of good people are putting music out. We'll have a lot to talk about soon. But for right now, I wanted to riff off this online thing that was happening, the 10 teenage albums thing. So I want to quickly talk about a few of the albums that I had on my list for that, because for me, at least, my teenage years were very formative for my hip-hop interest and sort of shaping my musical taste. Obviously, I would love to hear any of your top 10 teenage albums as well, as long as they're hip-hop and not pop-punk. That's cool if you like Saves the Day, but I don't need to hear about it. So a few of the records that stand out to me, and this could be a chance if you haven't heard some of these, maybe you could look back at them. The most obvious for me is the Black Star record, Mos Def, Talib Kweli. I still remember the day that came out, had my mom drive me to the record shop because I was a needy little child that needed my mom to help me do things. But that record really changed the way I listened to hip-hop. It really instilled a passion in hip-hop for me. I don't know if you've heard this, but it's Mos Def, Talib Kweli, produced by DJ High Tech, came out on Raucous Records. It's one of those projects where every track is just fucking incredible. And what they have going on lyrically is just insane. If you haven't heard like Definition before, I don't know how you live. And if you haven't seen it, look up the music video for Definition by Black Star. But Black Star, Mos Def, Talib Kweli, a record that really stands out to me. Another one, and I get a lot of shit for how much I like this artist. I've talked about him before, but Like Water for Chocolate by Common. Damn, that record was important to me during my high school years. This is one of those records as well that before I really knew who Dilla was, obviously the Dilla influence is all over this project production-wise. And I think it's definitely the last great album of what we'd maybe call like Common's first period, right? Because we have sort of Common's early career. We have the reinvigoration when Kanye starts producing him. And then we have recent old guy Kanye. But Like Water for Chocolate, wow. And a track on there that stands out to me still, although once again I like almost the whole record, is The Questions with Common and Mos Def. That's a really good one if you haven't heard it, so I recommend listening to that. Another thing, and this is a related album, Things Fall Apart by The Roots. I'm sure some of you have heard this, but another record that really stands out to me, and a record that I think represents a kind of change, both for The Roots and sort of solidifying a particular sound for them and really nailing in their production style. Famously, Questlove has talked about the change in their production style when Dilla encouraged him to approach his drumming differently and start to do some of that off-time stuff that Dilla had done production-wise. But The Roots, Things Fall Apart, another awesome record. And another good record, too, because this is a time where a lot of these artists I'm talking about were all working together. And, of course, at least two of these records, the Common record and the Roots record, come out of that whole Soulquarian period. If you don't know what it means when I say Soulquarian, you should Google it. The internet will tell you. But it was this group of musicians, including Mos Def and Talib Kweli and Common and The Roots and Jay Dilla and Erykah Badu and D'Angelo and a bunch of others. I'm leaving people out. That were all basically hanging out at Electric Land Studios in New York City for a couple years straight, all working on each other's projects. There's stories about, D'Angelo would be in one room, Dilla would be in another room, Erykah Badu would be upstairs, Common would be off to the side, and they'd all be bouncing in and out and working on each other's stuff. And you hear that in a bunch of these records. Another record, not hip hop per se, that comes out of that period is D'Angelo's Voodoo, which is another one, man. I wasn't really a big R&B guy until Voodoo came out, and that shit just changed me. And also it confused me because I remember all the girls in 8th and 9th grade were talking about how hot D'Angelo was in the Untitled video. And I watched it, and it made me uncomfortable, but then I realized that it's okay to appreciate beauty no matter who you're appreciating. Yeah, it sounds like I'm going into some weird territory, but I'm not. I just think that, you got to respect D'Angelo's abs circa 99. Real talk. I'll talk about like 2 more records real quick. Another one that I listened to all the time when I was younger was the Raucous Records Sound Bombing Volume 2 compilation. Raucous is a label that was operating out of New York in the 90s, early 2000s. A lot of great artists were on it. Obviously, Def and Kweli, Pharoah Monch was on that label. A lot of people you've heard. But the sound bombing compilations were really great because it brought together a lot of underground East Coast artists with some more mainstream artists. And sound bombing 2 in particular has my favorite Eminem verse ever on the song Any Man that I recommend listening to if you have not already. The last album I will bring up that was really crucial to me during those high school years was Big L, The Big Picture. God, Big L, rest in peace. Guru said it best. But man, I don't think anyone changed the way I thought about lyricism as much during my high school years as Big L. The way that guy raps is just insane. And sort of one of the first rappers that really stood out to me as well for really mixing a gritty, street-oriented style with a real lyrical, real clever, real complicated rhyme scheme type style. So Big L, as we know, passed way too early shortly after the album came out. He was killed. It sucks. But Big L, Big Picture. And a couple of other records I had on this list. Method Man's To Cal, important for me. A Tribe Called Quest, The Love Movement. I know that's a controversial pick. But either way, these are some records that were important to me when I was in high school. I recommend you go back and listen to all those because high school me wasn't that bad. It wasn't. I had a gorgeous mane of hair then. You don't know this, but I don't have a gorgeous mane of hair now. I think about this shit. But either way, listen to that. Hit me up on Twitter at Mick O'Brien if you want to tell me what you were listening to in high school. And I'll be back soon, and we'll be talking about some new releases. Get ready for it. But now we are back to Austin and Troy to teach you about knowledge and various other things. I'm out.
Cruising the sky as smoothly as a bird, you scarcely realize you are traveling.
All right, thanks for that, Michael. That's a pretty good list of teenage albums. I wonder how redacted that might have been. Do you know yours, Austin?
Yeah, but before I get into it, I have a gripe to level at Michael because he said to contribute if we want what our teenage albums were, unless it's pop punk, and then he threw out fucking Saves the Day. And that was one of the fucking albums of my teenage years, bro. It was, God, I don't remember the name of the album, but I can see the cover. They're like sitting on a sofa and everyone's like partying around them. I don't even remember what it was called, but I actually got into my car accident when I think I was 16 or 17, and I was listening to, I can still remember the song. I can remember the song. I remember the guitar. I remember listening to it when I got into my car accident. It wasn't a bad car accident, but I did total my older Camaro that I had at the time. So, but that's just because it was old and, it's not too hard to total it. But yeah, fuck you, Michael, man. That pop punk was my shit when I was like from 12 to 19.
Well, let me make an important distinction. There's pop punk like Save the Day, which fucking sucks. And then there's pop punk like my first 3 albums I ever bought on the same day when I was like 11 or 12 were Offspring's Smash,
Yep.
Green Day's Dookie, and Rancid's And Out Come the Wolves. All 3 albums that I still have and are still like classics of 90s pop punk. Now, this is before pop punk like in the late 90s became its own terrible thing.
Like Newfound Glory and Simple Plan and stuff like that.
Exactly, right? This is like the early to mid 90s like third wave punk, which was awesome.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember the first album that I bought that I had to like hide from my parents was Blink-182's Dude Ranch. because the song "Damn It" was the theme song for whatever year that was. I think I was 13. And it was the theme song for the X Games, and I was watching a commercial for the X Games, and all of a sudden and I was like, oh my God, what is that? I was like fucking 13. I was like, I gotta get that. And then I don't remember I got it, but they say fuck all the time. So I remember I would blast it in my room, and then whenever they would say fuck, I would like turn it down and then turn it back up. Oh God! But that was
that song Josie was on that album too, right? My Girlfriend song.
Yeah, my girlfriend takes me home when I'm too drunk to drive.
Yeah, it was a great song too.
Right? So, and then I got really into their older stuff too before that, which was Cheshire Cat and Buddha, which were their 2 albums before that. They didn't get released until later because they were just kind of like shitty demos, basically. Buddha especially was terrible. But but that was like my jam, dude. That and then there was a band called MXPX, who were a sort of Christian-y kind of band. Do you remember them?
Mixed Picks?
Yeah, well, because their real name was Magnified Plaid, but they went like MX and then PX, and then someone was just like, yeah, they're called MXPX. But yeah, they were huge. This band called the Orange County Supertones were like a Christian ska band that I was really into. That was my first concert that I ever went to. And then my first album I ever bought was actually Beatles Live at the Hollywood Bowl, though, when I was like 11 years old.
Weird, man.
I know. It was actually a cassette tape.
Yeah, that reminds me of my first show I ever went to. Not really a show, but a concert, outdoor concert experience. It was the John Williams Orchestra.
No shit! Was that at like the Hollywood Bowl or something?
Yeah, I think it was at the Hollywood Bowl.
Oh my gosh.
Star Wars, Indiana Jones, the whole thing. It was pretty great for like a 10-year-old.
Hell yeah. That's amazing, dude. Dude, I remember when I was 16 years old, my buddy Danny and I went to go see Blink-182 play with Bad Religion, and then a band called Phoenix TX, which they were kind of a transitional skate punk, pop punk band for a couple of years that had one album. They used to be called River Phoenix, actually, and then the family of River Phoenix basically put a cease and desist on them, and were like, hey, change the name, please. So they did. But I went to this concert. I lied to my dad about it, and my dad is, pretty conservative, evangelical dude. I lied to my dad about who I was going to see. My dad found out the concert I was going to, looked up online and found the lyrics for Blink-182, and there's that one song where literally it's shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, tits, fart, turd, and twat. He came to the Bren Center in Irvine, California to try to get me, and I'm in the front row with my buddy Danny, and we're sitting there getting ready for the concert, and I turn around, I swear to God, I see my dad coming down the stairs, and I'm like, to Dan, I'm like, bro, that's my dad. My dad is here. And Danny's like, dude, stop tripping. Your dad's not here. I'm like, bro, that's my dad. Like, I swear, because your dad's walk. He used to wear like Birkenstock. He still wears Birkenstock, like Jerusalem Cruiser shoes. So I was like, that's my fucking pops, man. And I was paranoid for the whole rest of the concert.
Wow. My first rock concert ever. It's not going to match that story, but I saw Dredge and Apex Theory.
Oh, Apex Theory is legit.
Yeah, 2 California bands.
Yeah.
And at the Roxy on Sunset, and I was 13 or 14, and I went with my best friend at the time, and I didn't know anybody like to take us or anything, so my cousin, who lived in downtown LA in some like tiny little flat in the middle of nothing on Sunset, let me stay at her place that night and took us, and I slept in a sleeping bag, and I felt so teenage.
Yeah,
amazing.
Yeah,
I was roughing it, man.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, man, that's so funny. Yeah, and I didn't even, like the albums that Michael talks about, I didn't even really get into any of those albums, which I know a few of them, right? But I didn't get into any of them until I was older. Like Black Star, I didn't even fucking know what that Black Star album was until I was like 25.
That's a pretty incredible album to have on your teenage list.
Yeah. He's been ahead of the game when it comes to his hip-hop tastes, I guess.
Can you guess my favorite hip-hop album from when I was a teenager?
Oh, okay. I'm thinking it's either The Chronic or no.
You think I'm that Angelino?
Yeah, you're LA, dude. I was gonna say Tupac, but since you're gonna be shitting on that now too, we'll go. Well, it's Tribe, right? So is it what's it called? The Whatever Fucking Theory?
I would consider that now, the Low End Theory, my favorite hip hop album of all time. And I got that in high school. This is true. But I didn't fully appreciate it until years and years later. Beastie Boys' Paul's Boutique, man.
Oh, okay.
That's the album.
I can see that.
That dirty 70s funk and all the samples and everything. Oh, I still love that album so much.
I can see that. I'm surprised that you weren't very LA friendly.
No, I mean, I liked all that stuff, but it was all background music to being in LA all the time. That was just like the standard stuff. The new stuff was the stuff that I found myself, and I was like, oh yeah, this is my shit.
See, for
Paul's
me,
Boutique, Low End Theory, stuff like that.
See, when I grew up, man, I grew up in Southern Orange County where it was straight up Sublime, pop punk, skate punk, No Effects, Pennywise. And then, of course, we listened to like Dead Kennedys and The Germs and X and stuff, Suicidal Tendencies. But for
all
me,
the cool stuff.
yeah, we did a little bit. But for me, that stuff was always secondary to Strung Out and, the Pharmaceutical Bandits, the RX Bandits. And stuff like that. That was the stuff that was prime. Vandals, That's so funny because it's the opposite for me. All that pop punk stuff was like background music because I heard it everywhere I went, in high school, on the radio, wherever. So when I found Dead Kennedys, Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables in high school, I was like, man, this is punk, man. Right.
I love this stuff. And that became my identity marker. It was the opposite.
God, that's so funny, man. Yeah. Good fun. The good old high school days. It literally seems like another lifetime ago. I don't think
I was the same person.
I don't even know that dude. Right on. Well, cool. Well, let's wrap this up. Hit us up on social media if you guys are still out there and you've made it this far. We'd love to hear from you. Maybe shoot us some topics, some things you'd like us to talk about. I know we did that a little bit in the past, and maybe we kind of got away from that. But we'd love to hear from you on, Instagram or Twitter about things that you'd like to hear us chat about, or if there are current events or things going on in the world that maybe we are not privy to or that we haven't addressed that you want to hear us bullshit about, or you want to recommend, maybe you want to come on the podcast and contribute or something like that. Hit us up. It's owls_at_Dawn. That's both Twitter and Instagram. And what else, Troy?
You can email us at owls.dawnpodcast@gmail.com.
Yes.
Other than that, shall we sign off?
Yes, sir.
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.